Have you ever heard a noise in the middle of the night that made your heart race? Maybe it was just a creak, maybe a faint whisper. You try to tell yourself it's nothing. But deep down, you know there's something more to it, something unsettling hiding just beneath the surface. These stories aren't from movies or books. They're from real people, ordinary lives suddenly pulled into the extraordinary. So, grab a blanket, maybe leave the lights on, because tonight, I'm going to take you through 5 terrifying true stories that'll make you question everything. Welcome to a night of fear you'll never forget. Our first story comes from Ethan, an experienced hiker who loved venturing into the mountains alone. It was his way of escaping the grind of everyday life. One weekend, he decided to hike a remote trail he'd never explored before. A rugged path, deep in the woods, far from any civilization. He was about 3 miles in, enjoying the quiet when he noticed something strange. About 50 feet off the trail, hidden between the trees, he saw what looked like a person. But they weren't moving. They were just standing there, completely still, facing away from him. At first, he thought it might be another hiker. But then, why weren't they walking? Feeling uneasy, Ethan continued on, quickening his pace. Every so often, he would glance back. But every time he did, the figure was still there, same distance, same posture, never getting closer, but never disappearing either. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time he reached a clearing where he planned to camp for the night, the sun had started to set. He set up his tent, lit a fire, and tried to calm himself down. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or his imagination playing tricks. That's what he told himself, anyway. But then, late that night, as he lay in his tent trying to fall asleep, he heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps just outside his tent. He held his breath, listening, hoping it was just an animal. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. Ethan slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside. His flashlight caught something, a figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. It was the same figure he'd seen before. Only this time, it was facing him. Terrified, Ethan grabbed his things and hiked through the night, not stopping until he reached his car at dawn. He never returned to that trail. To this day, he doesn't know who, or what, was following him. But sometimes, when he's out hiking, he can still feel eyes on him, watching, waiting. Ever had that feeling that someone's watching you, but you can't see them? Next, we have the story of Amanda and her family, who moved into an old Victorian house in a quiet town. The house had character, ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, high ceilings, but it also had something else. Something Amanda would soon discover. From the moment they moved in, strange things started happening. Lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves, and, most unsettling of all, the sound of footsteps coming from the attic late at night. At first, Amanda brushed it off. It was an old house, creaks and groans were normal, right? But things quickly escalated. One evening, while Amanda was cooking dinner, her young daughter came into the kitchen, holding something in her hand. "Look, Mommy," she said, smiling, "I found a friend." Amanda turned and froze. Her daughter was holding an old, worn-out doll she had never seen before. It looked like it had been buried for years, its dress was tattered, and its eyes were missing. Amanda asked her where she'd found it, and her daughter pointed upstairs, to the attic. Amanda's blood ran cold. They had never been in the attic. They hadn't even unpacked all their boxes yet. That night, after putting her daughter to bed, Amanda decided to check the attic herself. She climbed the narrow stairs, her heart pounding with each step. When she reached the top, she saw something she'd never forget. The entire attic was covered in dust except for a small area in the middle, where the doll had clearly been sitting. But that wasn't the worst part. In the dust surrounding the spot were small, childlike footprints, circling around it, as if someone or something had been playing with the doll. Amanda grabbed her daughter, and they left the house that night. They never returned. She later learned from a neighbor that the house had a dark history. A little girl had died there many years ago, alone, forgotten, clutching her favorite doll. Would you live in a house that's home to more than just memories? Story 3 takes us to a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. This one comes from Josh, a delivery driver who worked the night shift. He was used to driving late into the night, often traveling on empty roads with nothing but the radio to keep him company. One night, around 2 a.m., Josh was driving down a particularly lonely road, miles away from the nearest town. It was one of those nights where the darkness felt thicker, more oppressive than usual. There was no moon, just the inky blackness of the night stretching out in every direction. As he drove, something strange happened. His radio, which had been playing music, suddenly cut out. Then, out of nowhere, a piercing static filled the car. At first, he thought it was just a bad signal, but the static grew louder, almost deafening. He reached out to turn the radio off, but before he could, a voice cut through the static, a low, rasping voice that said just 2 words, "Turn around." Josh's heart skipped a beat. He scanned the road ahead, but there was nothing in front of him, just more empty highway. He was about to shrug it off as a weird radio glitch when he saw something in his rearview mirror. At first, it was just a faint shape, far behind him. But as he kept driving, the shape grew larger, closer. It was a figure, tall, thin, and unnaturally pale, standing in the middle of the road behind him. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight at him. Josh sped up, but no matter how fast he went, the figure seemed to stay the same distance behind him, like it was keeping pace. Panicked, Josh kept driving, refusing to look back again. After what felt like hours, he finally saw the lights of a gas station ahead. He pulled in, heart racing, and looked back at the road. The figure was gone. He never found out what or who it was. But to this day, every time he drives down that highway at night, he feels like he's being followed. Have you ever been driving alone at night and felt like you weren't alone after all? Our fourth story takes place in an old apartment complex in the city. Maggie, a young woman who had just moved in, quickly noticed something strange about her new home. From the first night, she could hear voices, soft whispers, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. At first, she tried to ignore it. The building was old, and old buildings make weird noises, right? But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder. They were unintelligible at first, just a low murmur. But soon, she could start making out words. "Leave," the voices said. "Get out." Maggie was terrified, but she didn't know what to do. She even asked her neighbors if they'd heard anything strange, but no one else seemed to notice. It was just her. One night, the whispers became unbearable. They echoed through the apartment, louder and louder, until it felt like they were coming from inside her head. In a panic, Maggie ran out of the building and down the street. As soon as she left, the voices stopped. She refused to go back, even to grab her things. Instead, she called a friend and asked him to go in for her. When he entered the apartment, he found it eerily quiet. But as he gathered her belongings, he noticed something chilling. Written on the walls, in what looked like dust or ash, were the same words Maggie had heard: "Leave. Get out." Maggie never returned to that apartment. Whatever was in those walls, she didn't want to stick around to find out. What would you do if your home started telling you to leave? Would you listen? Our final story tonight takes place in a small town, where a group of friends stumbled upon something they wish they hadn't. It was a warm summer evening, and the group, 5 friends, were looking for something to do. One of them suggested they explore the old graveyard just outside of town. It had been abandoned for decades, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by most of the town. When they arrived, the sun had just set, and the graveyard was bathed in an eerie glow. They walked through the rusted gates, laughing and joking, but their excitement quickly turned to unease. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like they were being watched. As they made their way deeper into the graveyard, they came across a small, crumbling mausoleum. One of the friends dared the others to go inside, and because they were young and fearless, they did. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange, faded symbols. But the most unsettling thing was the smell, a putrid, rotting stench that seemed to cling to the air. One of the friends, a girl named Sarah, started feeling lightheaded. She stumbled, knocking over an old, cracked urn that was sitting on a pedestal. As it shattered on the ground, a cold wind rushed through the mausoleum, despite there being no windows. Suddenly, Sarah collapsed. Her friends rushed to help her, but she was unresponsive, her skin pale and clammy. They carried her out of the mausoleum and back to the car, speeding to the nearest hospital. Sarah recovered, but she was never the same after that night. She claimed she could still feel the cold presence that had overwhelmed her in the mausoleum, like it had followed her home. Her friends brushed it off as trauma from the incident, but Sarah was convinced something had latched onto her in that graveyard. She eventually moved away, but no matter where she went, she always felt like something was watching her. Something, waiting. Would you dare to explore an abandoned graveyard at night? Sometimes, the things we disturb should be left forgotten.